Hi there. This is a hybrid meeting training that has been put together by Southeast Uplift, and we are excited to share some tips for how to run successful hybrid meetings. We're going to start out by talking about why it's important to host these meetings in the first place. Then we're going to go into some tips for getting started. We're going to talk about helpful technology that should be at most hybrid meetings and also look at a successful example setup. After that, we're going to look at some just kind of general accessibility tips for meetings. And then we're going to wrap up and share some resources. So, getting started, why is it important to host hybrid meetings in the first place? As our communities continue to navigate the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot more people are getting vaccinated, and there's a widespread desire to kind of transition away from the virtual meetings that many of us have been attending for the last year and a half. However, for some folks, virtual meetings really opened up possibilities for participation that didn't exist before. And so there's a risk in those participants losing access that they were able to gain through the widespread use of virtual meetings. Another thing to consider is that there has been a pretty widespread critique about virtual spaces, that they may not always foster the same feeling of connection that in person meetings do. So, hybrid meetings, when set up intentionally, can really offer the best of both worlds. Talking about that a little more in depth, hybrid meetings are also really important for inclusion, and they benefit a wide variety of community members, which includes parents and caregivers, folks who are disabled, folks who work, older folks, people who maybe don't have as reliable transportation as others, and then folks who are kind of distant or in a rural area but still want to attend meetings. Getting started, we're going to talk a little bit about just some general things to think about when it comes to setting up hybrid meetings. The first thing is that running a hybrid meeting definitely involves some very intentional planning up front to ensure that both in person and virtual participants are able to participate fully. There is an article linked on this slide that is all about what it takes to run a great hybrid meeting, and it's a really good place to get started. It's also really helpful to keep in mind that not all hybrid meetings are going to look the same. Sometimes they might need more technology than others if it's a larger meeting. Um, if the purpose of the call is just kind of a short check in, probably will need less technology. And there's some other considerations, some of which we're going to talk about in terms of just knowing like what's actually needed for that particular event or meeting. Starting out, there's a few things that are really helpful to think through in terms of who's doing what and what people's roles are going to look like, how the space is going to be set up, and those sorts of things. It can be really helpful to designate a moderator whose role is only to support virtual participants. And that includes things like monitoring the chat, ensuring questions are answered, and it can also be helpful for this person or someone else in the meeting to set clear ground rules for communication at the start. It also can be a good idea to decide ahead of time who's going to be setting up technology and testing it all out. That's one thing. It's really vital to test everything out before the meeting starts. Obviously, we can't always anticipate what kinds of technical difficulties are going to come up, but generally, if you spend about 30 minutes testing everything out ahead of time, you can kind of work out most of the issues. And I would say, especially when you're just starting out and becoming more familiar with the technology, 30 minutes to an hour is great. And as things kind of become more familiar and easier to set up, it can be like a 10-minute process just to plug everything in and test it out. But definitely don't feel bad if you need to spend a little bit more time getting familiar with everything. It's also helpful to think about who is going to store the technology in between meetings or events and who's responsible for it if it needs to be repaired or if something else happens and there needs to be someone kind of overseeing the process for ordering new technology or something along those lines. And then the last tip is just to know your event space. And that entails being sure to set up in person seating in a way that's conducive to allowing participants to view each other. Also, being able to address any like physical accessibility concerns, which is something we're going to talk about later. So, this is an example of what a potential hybrid meeting setup can look like. So, at kind of the head of an imaginary table, we have the presenter. We also have some in person participants. And then we have a laptop, which specifically is one serving as the webcam in this case, and also is allowing the four in person participants to be able to see the virtual participants. Behind that laptop is a screen. So ideally, in this situation, there would be a projector that's kind of projecting the virtual participants onto that screen, and the laptop obviously would need to be connected to it. You also have your moderator who's kind of like monitoring the laptop, monitoring what the virtual participants are doing, and then the virtual participants know that there's somebody looking out for them. So if they have any needs or questions, that will be able to be met. And this is kind of, as you can see, there's also a microphone in this image, which we're going to talk about in the next couple slides, just to make sure that the sound is being amplified for the virtual participants and that everyone is able to hear and participate in the same way as much as possible. So now that we've kind of looked at what a possible setup for a hybrid meeting could look like, here are some of the pieces of technology that I mentioned that are necessary for most hybrid meetings. So, one of the more obvious ones is a stable internet connection, super important to ensuring that virtual participants are able to have a good quality call. And the next thing is to have at least one laptop or tablet with a webcam and speakers. The speakers can either be built in or connected to your device, same with the webcam. And specifically, the webcam should be positioned so that virtual attendees can see all the in person attendees as much as possible. And there will be times, especially with larger meetings, where it's really hard to fit everyone onto the screen, and depending on what's going on, that might be okay, but there's also a potential for adding in maybe a second web camera, adding a second laptop. Um, so it just really depends on the space and number of participants and other factors that you're working with. It's also important to have some sort of virtual meeting platform, which is pretty obvious. um, Whichever one you choose, make sure that automatic captions are enabled. That's really important for access. And Zoom is one example, but there are many other platforms that offer captions. And staff are happy to recommend any of those to folks who may not be familiar with the options. Another thing that is really helpful to have is at least one large screen so that in-person participants are going to clearly be able to see virtual participants. So that's something that we saw in the example where there was a laptop for the like virtual participants to be able to see the folks in person, And then the in-person folks had a screen to look at to see the virtual participants. So everyone is always able to see each other. Everyone feels like they're kind of in the same room, even if they're not. And it can kind of help to create that sense of connectedness that wouldn't be there otherwise. And then the last thing on here is a handheld or tabletop microphone. It says microphones plural because, especially if you are having a large meeting, you definitely are going to want to have multiple to ensure that everyone's voices and all the sound is being picked up. A little bit more about microphones. Um, is that they're very important. It's actually vital to have microphones at all meetings, including solely in person meetings. Um, Handheld mics are great for in person, they also work for virtual meetings, but sometimes require a little bit more setup than a tabletop mic that you literally just plug into a laptop. The next point is more about that. Basically, the type of mic and the number of mics used are really going to depend on the size of the room and the number of participants. So, if you have a larger meeting in a big space, you're definitely going to want to use multiple handheld mics. That's going to be way more effective than a single tabletop mic. Regardless of what kind of mic you use, it will need to be plugged into some sort of speaker or a computer, and it needs to amplify the sound for both virtual and in person attendees. So, just as an example, if you're in a big space and you're not sure how well the sound is going to be amplified, you might even have like a tabletop mic plugged into the laptop itself, which is transmitting the sound directly to your virtual participants. But then also, you are going to have a few handheld mics that you're going to pass around to make sure that the sound is being amplified for your in-person participants as well, and that will help carry the sound to that tabletop microphone so that overall you're just amplifying sound as much as possible. And if you're kind of new to all of this and you're like, why are mics even necessary? What are we doing? I definitely recommend checking out this resource and video from Rooted in Rights about why we should all be using microphones for meetings. There's a few other pieces of technology that we wanted to recommend. But a lot of these things can involve a larger upfront investment or basically a use of funds that not all groups have access to. The first one is a projector. This is basically one of the best possible resources that you could have for a hybrid meeting because it really ensures that your in person participants are going to be able to see the hybrid folks. Um, Also, obviously, if you do have a projector, you're going to need a surface to project on that tends to look like um, a regular projector screen, but even like a sheet is great or a blank wall. Another thing to consider is investing in high quality sound amplification equipment, um, mostly for the use of mics, but also there are some other kind of like accessibility tools like headsets and portable hearing loops, which you can see a picture of on the screen. These are mostly to increase access for in person attendees who are hard of hearing, but I definitely recommend investing in at least a few just to have out at meetings and turn them on ahead of time. And if folks want to grab one, then they can, and just give people that option. Some folks may qualify to receive financial support for purchasing technology. We wanted to share some resources that we knew of. One example is Free Geek, and they are a nonprofit resource in Southeast Portland Free Geek offers affordable tech to community groups that may be able to help bridge some technology gaps. And if you are a neighborhood association that is served by Southeast Uplift, you can also use your communication funds to purchase technology as well. The next thing we're going to kind of talk about is a successful example setup. So, this first photo was taken at the Tin Can Phone podcast hybrid event, which was on May 29th at the Southeast Uplift Main Street building. People for Mutual Education were the event hosts, and they held the event with remote viewers from a Facebook Live broadcast, and Zoom was used as the video platform here. There were two in person hosts, which those two seats that you can see in that picture is where the hosts were sitting, and they were kind of leading the conversation primarily. And there were also in person participants who I'll show in the next photo who were sitting behind everything. And the in person hosts obviously were there, but there were also two remote speakers, and they were kind of broadcast on the projector, as you can see in this image. You might also notice that there is a laptop on a table that is pointed in the direction of the in person participants, and there is also a projector on the gray table, which is projecting the in this obviously it's the image of the film they were watching, but in the case of the virtual speakers, the speakers would have been on that screen. So this is another view of kind of the other side of things. And you can see that the group is kind of sitting in a half circle of chairs, and that kind of was around the where like the area where the hosts were sitting, and this way all of the event participants could see each other. So they have like a webcam looking back at kind of the in-person participants. There is a way for the in-person participants to be able to see the virtual participants on the PowerPoint, or I should say the projector slide. And there are a few things that could have been done differently, which we're going to touch on, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what actually made this a successful hybrid event. An event participant shared some feedback about the event. Um, they said that what made this hybrid event successful was that there were clear ground rules for communication. That's like the order and the style. And then the hosts kept the conversation active and made sure that the comments from the audience were being responded to and noticed. This participant detailed some equipment and what that looked like. So they had a screen to display the remote speakers. They had an all direction input microphone. From the last image, it looked like it was a tabletop mic. They had a set of speakers which were amplifying the remote speakers to the in person crowd. They had the projector, which you saw, the laptop, which you saw. Obviously, ensured that they were able to have a solid video platform, Wi Fi, and then some of the other things that were mentioned here, such as the chairs, refreshments, were all things to ensure that the in person participants were as comfortable as possible. You'll also see that they mentioned like rugs and props that helped create a comfortable feeling, and um, also noticing how the like quote unquote core participants were four people, so the two in person and two remote speakers, and then there were a dozen people in person, but tons of online participants. And obviously, not every virtual meeting will look this way, but I think this gives a good idea of what to expect, like having a few core speakers. Some might be in person, some might be virtual, having like a handful of people in person, and then potentially a larger amount of folks attending virtually. And that could be different if you have a lot of folks who like to show up in person, but that is something to be aware of, that you may have more virtual attendees than in person at some time. So, what could be improved? I think personally, having a way for the virtual participants to see the in person speakers, that might even just be like an extra webcam you can kind of flip around. Um, that would have been fantastic, because that is one issue, is that you always want to try and ensure that virtual attendees can always see the person or persons who are speaking. Also, I think that one thing that can always happen is a more proactive use of mics or other tools to increase accessibility. They definitely did have one tabletop microphone, which is awesome, but perhaps, especially if there was audience participation from the in person folks, kind of making sure there's another microphone to kind of help with the in person accessibility. And then I wanted to kind of leave the last one open. Is there anything else that you can think of that you would have liked to have seen, or that you think would have increased access to this event? Going off of that slide, I did want to provide some general accessibility tips, because a lot of what we do around hybrid meetings is to ensure that more folks are able to participate equally in the same ways as folks who are able to show up in person. So, starting out, I really recommend checking out this general article on tips for hosting accessible, both virtual and hybrid events. I think it's also really important to ensure that participants can make accommodations requests prior to the event or meeting. If this is new to you and you need more information about how to respond to those requests, there's a really great resource by the Office of Community and Civic Life that we highly recommend. It's also really important to be prepared to hire an ASL interpreter and to know the process for doing that ahead of time. So, if this is new to you, there's another resource from the Office of Community and Civic Life that is also really helpful in kind of understanding what that process looks like. And then the last point is to never assume that all access needs are being met just because no one has asked for accommodations. Um, Always aim to set up hybrid meetings to be as accessible as possible from the start, because you never know when someone is going to show up and need accommodations last minute. And obviously, there are some things that you won't be able to provide, like an ASL interpreter last second, but even just having a general idea of like having large print materials for in person attendees. And also, yeah, knowing for sure that your captions are enabled on whichever video platform you're using. Like taking steps proactively to ensure that things are going to be as accessible as possible from the start. One last thing I wanted to mention about this is that just because a meeting is being held in person, that doesn't make it inherently accessible. So, if you do have an in person component, there are accessibility considerations for those participants. And I've listed some on this slide that are important aspects to address in your planning process. One of those, obviously, I mentioned before, is physical accessibility considerations. So that's basically thinking, can someone with a wheelchair even move through this space? Can someone even access this building? And kind of thinking through, like, logistically, what are potential issues in your event space and how can you resolve those ahead of time? Another thing to think about is scent policies. And this is pretty specific to folks with like multiple chemical sensitivities, but also there are lots of folks who have like sensory related disabilities where scent can be really overwhelming. And this can be easy in terms of just encouraging people to wear like unscented products the day of the meeting. And being upfront with folks about the fact that scent is all can be something that can be distracting at best or extremely harmful for certain folks at worst, and it is definitely something that can cause people not to be able to participate. Another thing that's really helpful is just to build in time for breaks. I think most people benefit from having breaks, especially during long meetings. And then also considering something we kind of talked about a little bit with captions and interpreters, but making sure that your meetings are accessible for deaf and hard of hearing folks, and also blind and low vision folks. And there are going to be some further resources on the resources slide, more about that. Kind of just wrapping up first before we get to that point, gonna just give a general overview of some of the things that we talked about. So, hybrid meetings, awesome way to ensure that folks are able to participate in the way that feels best and most accessible to them. And these meetings can be successful when they're planned intentionally and in a way that prioritizes accessibility. As we talked about, hybrid meetings are going to look differently based on various factors like the number of attendees, the type of meeting, the length of the event, and I really encourage folks to be creative with how meetings are structured and the ways that attendees can interact with each other. Like, there is no one way to run a hybrid meeting, and I think just have fun with it and test things out and see how it goes. This kind of connects to this next point where some meetings are going to run more smoothly than others. Like, even if you're a pro at setting up hybrid meetings, there's going to be one meeting where all of the tech is not doing well. And so it does get easier with practice. It does help to set things up ahead of time and get familiar with things. But I definitely encourage folks to practice, to try new things, try different things, try and find the best way that works for you and your participants. And even when those things are difficult at first, recognizing that it is going to get easier and give yourself some grace because this is something that not a ton of folks have experience with. And I am confident that people can learn this ability. It just takes some practice. The last thing is to reach out for help. If this is really overwhelming or complicated and you are not sure if it's something that you can do, I would recommend just getting in touch with the Southeast Uplift staff, and folks are going to be able to answer your questions to the best of their ability. And if there are things that the staff don't know, we can absolutely refer you to other resources for support. So there are usually definitely ways to figure things out and come up with solutions. And like the last point, I just recommend like being creative and not getting discouraged. So these are some of the things that I was mentioning. We have a ton of resources. One, just about like running events and what some best practices look like. but also some general tips on accessibility. So, a lot of what you see here is already linked in the slides, but I definitely recommend checking out the Like the Mic video and resource page from Rooted in Rights. Southeast Uplift's website actually has several different accessibility resources, and also the Office of Community and Civic Life has an absolute ton of accessibility resources. And I think anyone who's interested in hybrid meetings should be reading as many of these as possible and kind of just getting familiar with what accessibility looks like for both in person participants and virtual participants, because I think this is kind of the key to being able to run successful hybrid meetings is really making sure that you know your stuff, you know the tech, and you also know how to be inclusive and ensure that anyone showing up to your meeting is going to have the same kind of experience, whether they're in person or virtual, and making sure that able bodied folks aren't having a different experience or a quote unquote better experience than folks with disabilities who are attending. So, to wrap up, I hope that this resource helps with running hybrid meetings and kind of getting an idea of what's involved, what different roles look like, and also just getting started with thinking through technology issues and accessibility issues. As I said, Southeast Uplift staff are available to support, so please reach out. A lot of other groups are also going to be in the same position as kind of the pandemic wanes. A lot more people are going to be running hybrid meetings. So you are not alone in this. And I really recommend just kind of, again, talking, being creative, brainstorming, setting things up in different ways. If something feels weird, getting feedback from especially virtual participants, but in person as well. And just trying your absolute best to make things more accessible and inclusive.